We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Nun Amud Aleph in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 150a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing the Mishnah which says that by a matna shchiv meira, if the person is on his deathbed and he gives a gift, he gives away all of his property, but he retains a little bit of property. And the way the Mishnah phrases it is he retains a little bit of land for himself. So then we say, since he retained that land for himself, even if he recovers from his illness, we still say that the gift that he gave is considered to be effective, and the recipient does in fact receive that gift. And the Gemara wanted to know how much land does he actually have to retain for himself. And the Gemara brought various Amoraim, and one of the Amoraim said that it doesn't actually have to be land. It can even be metaltal, and it can even be movable objects, as long as it's enough to provide for his livelihood. So the idea is he's retaining for himself enough for his livelihood. That means even if he recovers, he intended to give the gift. That's what the Gemara said in the previous Amud. And Rav Yosef asked on that, how can you say that when the Mishnah says land, it also means movable objects? If you're being precise in terms of the language of the Mishnah, we should say that it only means land. And so Abaye responded to Rav Yosef that we have a Mishnah in Peah, and the Mishnah in Peah discusses a person giving everything, all of his property, to his Eved, and we say that the Eved goes free. But it says in the Mishnah that if the person says that some karka I'm not going to give to you, so then we assume that that karka is actually referring to the Eved himself, because avodim are compared to karka, they're compared to land, and therefore what he's really saying is that he's retaining for himself the karka, meaning the Eved, and he's not really setting the Eved free. And on that Mishnah in Peah, V'yomer Avdimi Bar Yosef, Amar Rebbe Elazar, Avdimi Bar Yosef says that Rebbe Elazar says, Asu metaltal and shiur eitzel eved, that when we say that if the person said karka, it doesn't only mean karka, it means metaltalin as well. That also is considered a shiur as far as the eved. It's like he's retaining, so to speak, the eved for himself when he's saying that he's retaining some metaltalin for himself. And so therefore the point is, you see from here that metaltalin can be considered karka. Even though the Mishnah says karka, it doesn't just mean karka, it means metaltalin as well. And Rebbe Elazar continued and said that's true when it comes to this halacha by Eved. However, v'lo asu metaltalin shiur eitzel ksuba. It's not true by ksuba. We'll see the Rashbam in a moment. Their metaltalin is not the equivalent of karka. And the Rashbam explains, V'yomer Avdimi Yomer Rebbe Elazar asu af agav dekatani shayir karka kolshu lo yotze ben chorin. Even though the language of the Mishnah actually is that if he retains any amount of land for himself, the Eved doesn't go free. But hu adinim shayir metaltalin kolshu, the same is actually true if he retains any amount of movable objects for himself. The avdanami can metaltali dummy, because an Eved can also be considered movable. Shareinu mechuber lakarka, because he's not actually attached to the ground. The karule bnei adam metaltali, people would refer to an Eved as metaltalin, so the Eved might be referred to as karka, because avodim in general are compared to karka, but they also might be referred to as metaltalin because they move around. Anyway, the point is, Alma, we see afagav de katani karka, even though the Mishnah says karka, lav dafka, it doesn't necessarily have to only mean karka. Elahu adin lemetaltali, the same could be true by movable objects. Umasnisa nami, we should apply the same to our Mishnah. Metaltali kadei parnasaso, if he retains for himself movable objects enough for his livelihood, kimekarkoi kadei parnasaso dami, that might be exactly the same as retaining land for himself enough for his livelihood. And then Rebbe Elazar continued and said, this idea that metaltalin is equivalent of karka, that's true by this case of Eved, but it's not true by ksuba. And the Rashbam explains, V'lo asu metaltali shiur eitzel ksuba, we don't say this when it comes to ksuba. The Tanan Gabe Dahiba Meseches Peyo V'Pirkin de La'el Maisinan Lo Parshinan La. We have the following. It says over there in Meseches Peyo, and it says earlier as well. We explain it. Hakosev Nechasav Levanov. It says, let's say a person writes over his property to his sons. However, V'Chasav LeIshto Karka Kolshu, but he does give his wife. He writes over to his wife some amount, any amount of land. So the halacha is of the ksubasa. The halacha is she loses out on her ksuba because of that. Some over there say the cases where she was silent, she accepted, so to speak. Uperish Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman explained what's the logic of this. Since she now became treated like one of the children, she's like a partner in terms of the inheritance of the ksubasa, she loses her ksuba. Because of that land that he left for her, that he didn't give to his sons, machla ksubasa, she was mochel, she forgave the ksuba. And over there, v'davka karka kolshu. It's only true if it's land. Aval shayir lavechasav lametaltalin kolshu. But let's say he retains for her, gives to her a little bit of movable objects. Lo avda ksubasa. There, she doesn't lose her ksuba. The ksuba ikar govami karkoi v'lomi metaltali, because a ksuba, the main collection is from land and not from movable objects. But Meseches ksuba is hilkach. Therefore, amekarkoi sam chadaita. She's relying on getting land. Ulakach lo asu metaltalin shir l'ksubasa. Therefore, metaltalin will not be the equivalent of land in this case. case, it's not considered shear for her ksuba. Timshayr lahabal metaltalin, again, if he gave her a little bit of metaltalin, v'nasan he gave that to her, k'shachilak nechasav levanav, when he distributes his property to his sons, v'chasav le'ishto metaltalin, and kolshu, he gives her a little bit of metaltalin, lo avda ksuba, so she would not lose her ksuba in that situation. And the Gemara continues, hasam over there by the case of Evid, bidinhu delolis ni karka, it makes sense that it wouldn't say karka. V'aidi de tonaresha, but since it says in the beginning, Rabbi Akiva says, karka kolshu chayeves bepeya uva bikurim, that any amount of land is chayev in peya and bikurim, v'lichtov aleim prusbul, and is good enough to write a prusbul, v'liknos imoim nechasim she'ein lohem achrayis bekesef uv'shtar v'chazaka, and you can acquire together with any amount of land property that does not have a lien, meaning movable property. You can use the kinyanim of land, the kinyanim of kesef and shtar and chazaka. So since it said that, mishum hachi katani karka, it's just for that reason that it says karka over there, but for no other reason. And the Rashbam explains, Amar le Rav Yosef li Abaya, this is not in the text of our Gemara, but this is Rav Yosef, this line in the Gemara is Rav Yosef responding to Abaya, and saying as follows, Li'olam malach, really I'll say to you, Kol heicha detani karka davko, anytime that it says karka in the Mishnah, it really does mean karka, and that was the basis of Rav Yosef's question, how can you say over here by the matna shchimera that karka means metaltalin as well? V'hacha gabe Eved, but over here, in this case in Meseches Peya, by the case of the Eved going free, hainu taima delav davka, the reason why we don't take the word karka literally, we don't say it only means karka, but we say it can mean metaltalin as well, because really it doesn't have to say anything about land. Really, the Mishnah actually should have said metaltalin. It should have said that if he's shy or any amount of metaltalin, so then we say it's referring to the Eved, and the Eved doesn't go free. Why does it say karka at all in this Mishnah in Peya? The only reason is because since the beginning of the Mishnah Meseches Peya, it says Rabbi Akiva Omer karka kolshu chayeves bepeyo v'bikurim v'lichtov ala prusbul v'liknos imoin nechasim shein lamachrayis bekesuf v'shtar v'chazaka. It talks about other halachas related to karka. Dahani kulu davka mikarkoi. Now those are certainly halachas that are relevant only to land. All of those halachas in the list. V'lo metaltali, it's not relevant to metaltal, to movable objects. So it's just for that reason. Tananami seifa karka. That's why the end of the Mishnah uses this word karka. Afagav dehu adin b'seifa l'metaltal. Even though of course it would be true at the end of the Mishnah there with metaltal as well, as we said. Because these are talking about things that are kolshu, similar kinds of language, that's why they are learned together. And the Gemara continues, V'chol heicha detani kolshu. This is Abaya responding to Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef also asked on the previous Amud that the language of the Mishnah by the case of the Shchimei was that if he retains for himself karka kolshu, any amount, and one of the interpretations of the Amoraim on the previous Amud was it doesn't really mean any amount, it means enough for the person's livelihood. And Rav Yosef asked on that, but it says kolshu, and therefore kolshu should have no minimum. And so Abaya says to Rav Yosef, is that really true? V'chol heicha detani kolshu, anytime that it says kolshu, less shiura, there is no minimum amount, but that's not true. Vatnan, but we learned in the Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Meseches Chulin, Rabbi Dosa ben Horkanes Omer, Rabbi Dosa ben Horkanes says, Chamesh rechelos, you have 5 sheep, gozizos monim monu pras, and each one is going to have the weight of wool of a monu pras, which is the weight of 150 dinar, chayavos bereishis hagez, so that amount of wool is going to be chayiv in the halacha of reishis hagez, the wool is given, a portion of the wool is given to the Kohen. V'chachamim omer, but the Chachamim say, Chamesh rechelos gozizos kol shein, they say, these 5 sheep that are being sheared, it's any amount that's going to be chayiv. V'amrinan, and we say on that, v'kama kol shein, how much is a kol shein? It's not any amount, there actually is a minimum amount. Amar Rav says, mana upras, it's a total of a mana upras, that's a total weight of 150 dinar, meaning it's not 150 dinar weight of wool from each sheep, but it's a total among all of them. Uvilvad shiu mechumashas, as long as it's divided evenly among the 5 sheep. And so we see from this Mishnah that even though it uses the language of kolshu, which seems to be any amount, there actually is a minimum amount. And the Gemara continues that Rav Yosef responds, Hasam over there, Bedinhu delo lisni kolshu. Really, the Mishnah should never have used the phrase kolshu, because again, there is a minimum amount, and generally kolshu means there is no minimum. However, va'aidi dekamar Tanakama shiura rabba, since the Tanakama gave such a large amount of wool, because the Tanakama said a mono pras from each sheep, so amariyu nami shiura zuta. So therefore, the response of the Chachamim in the Mishnah was a very small amount. They use the language of kolshu, but of course there is a minimum amounts. Again, kari la kolshu, it's just referred to as a kolshu in that Mishnah, but in general, Rav Yosef is saying when the term kolshu is used, we should take that literally and say there is no minimum amount. And the Rashbam explains, V'yomer le Abaye Rav Yosef, Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Da'akshi la'el l'man damar kadei parnasaso, kolshu tanan. Again, the question earlier that Rav Yosef asked was that you're saying it's the amount for livelihood, but doesn't it say kolshu? V'chalecha de tanan kolshu milo ba'inan shiura, but is that really true? When it says kolshu, isn't there really should be a minimum amount, says Abaye. V'hatanan, because we learned in the Mishnah, but Perikorashus Hageiz in Meseches chulin, Chamish rechelos gozezos kol achas v'achas mishkal mano pras, slightly different gear so that the Rashbam has, but again 5 sheep, and each one, the weight of the wool should be a mano pras, which is litra v'chatzi litra. That's a litra and a half a litra. Again, as we said, that's 150 dinar, that weight. Chayeves b'reishus hageiz, that's the amount that's chayev in reishus hageiz. Divrei Rabbi Dosa, that's the opinion of Rabbi Dosa. Umechamesh tzon asuyos, and that comes from 5 sheep. Nafka lehu lebeis hillel debein and chamesh. We learned that out from chamesh tzon asuyos a pasuk. That's where Beis Hillel learns out that we need 5. The Chachamim omrim hey rechelos, and the Chachamim they respond again that it's between all of them that amount. Amar Rav says manu upras bein chamishasan. It means to say again a manu upras among all 5 of them. Uvelvachu mechumoshos kol achas. It means to say even though they use the language of kolshu, it really means that among the 5 you have that amount as long as it's divided evenly among the 5. Yesh bot semer chomesh al manu pras. Each one is 1/5 of the manu pras. Each sheep is providing that proportionate amount of wool. But if it would be less than that, that would be like nothing. And so the question again was, it seems that the language of kolshu does have a minimum amount, and the response of Rav Yosef was that over there in that Mishnah, so since the Tanakama said shiura rabbah said a large amount, mono pras l'chol achas, that's a mono pras for each sheep, so Tana seifanami shira zuta, so that's why the response at the end of the Mishnah was a small amount using the language of kolshu, but the point is, avol masnisin de katani kolshu, but in our Mishnah where it says kolshu, dafko, we should say that actually means any amount. V'hilkach lo mechavnon shmaita desabi, therefore, it's not so precise, the teaching of the elders, that it really means the amount for a livelihood. Again, that was the question of Rav Yosef. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Gemara says, Pshita is obvious. Amar metaltali leplanya. If a person says that I'm giving my metaltal and my movable objects to so-and-so, so that we understand that to mean, kol monei tashmishte, we understand that to mean all of the person's utensils, all of the person's vessels, kani, that the recipient will acquire, levar mechite visari, with the exception of wheat and barley. Things like wheat and barley are not included in the word metaltali. When we say metaltali leplanya, it just means to say vessels and utensils. However, the Gemara continues, kol metaltali leplanya. Let's say the way it's phrased is all of my movable objects go to so-and-so. So then afilu chite visari, so then we say it includes even wheat and barley. And not only that, the Gemara says, va'afilu rechaim ho'elyona kane, even the upper millstone the person acquires, levar me rechaim hatachtona, but with the exception of the lower millstone, that would not be included in all of one's movable objects. And finally, the Gemara says, kol de metaltal, if the way it's phrased is anything that moves at all, so then afilu rechaim hatachtona kani, then even the lower millstone will be acquired by the recipient. And the Rashbam explains, Amar Shchiv Meirav, someone on his deathbed, if he says, metaltali leplanya, that I'm giving my movable objects to so-and-so, and the Rashbam notes, V'hu adin lebori al yedei kinyan, the same would be true if it was a healthy person giving it away, and he used a formal kinyan. Levar mechiti v'sari, again, that does not include the wheat and the barley. V'hu adin levar mi behemosav, the same would also be that it excludes his animals, kein nira be'enai. Rashbam says this appears to be correct in my eyes. And the Rashbam continues, Afilu rechaim ho'elyona, again, even the upper millstone, if the person says kol, if he says all of them, sheregilin litla misham kadei l'sakna, because that's something that the person regularly will take from that area in order to fix it. Avol rechaim hatachtona b'mekoma misakna nosa, but when it comes to the lower millstone, if they need to fix it, they fix it right there in its place. But if he says kol metaltal, if he says anything that moves, so then kol sheyechol metaltalo she'eno mechuber lakarka mamish, that would mean anything that's even able to be moved, as long as it's not attached to the ground. That would include even the lower millstone, v'afalpi she'ein regilin letaltal, even though it's something that's not regularly moved, but it would still be included as something that can be moved. And the Gemara continues, Iboy Lahu, they had the following question, Avda k'mekarka o k'metaltal adami, our avodim, our slaves, are they considered to be like land or like movable objects? And the Rashbam explains, Iboy Lahu, they had the following question, Avda k'metaltal adami, our slaves considered to be like movable objects, Nihi vadai da avda k'mekarka adami linyan shvua v'kinyan b'kesef uv'shtar v'chazaka. The Rashbam says for sure, slaves are considered like land in terms of taking an oath, in terms of the kinyonim that are used to acquire slaves. T'chol mili do raisa din mekarka yesh anything that's doraisa, they have the status of land. We learned that out from the pasuk. However, when it comes to the way people will speak about avodim, they're called movable. V'yeshnon bechlal matnas metaltali. And so then maybe we should say that they're included. Let's say there's a gift of metaltalin, they should be included, shari metaltalihu, because they're able to move. Or maybe we do not say that. That's the question of the Gemara. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Ravacha Breda Ravavula Ravashi, Ravacha the son of Ravavia said to Ravashi, Tashma, come in here, a proof from the Mishnah. Hamocheres O'ir, let's say a person sells a city, so what's included in the sale of the city? Machar Botim Shichin Ma'aros Merchatzos, Ubeis Habadin, Ubeis Hashalchin. So included in the sale of the city is the sale of the houses and the pits and the ditches and the bathhouses and the Beis Habadin, which are the olive presses, and the Beis Hashalchin, which means the fields, referring usually to irrigated fields, but it means the fields over here. Avaloes HaMetaltalin, however, not included in the sale of the city is metaltalin. Movable objects are not included in the sale of the city. However, uvizman sha'amar hi v'chol ma shebesocha, if the person who's selling says that I'm selling the city and everything inside of it, so afilu hayuba behema o avodim, even if there are animals and slaves, harekul and mechurin, they're all sold, they're all included together in the sale. And the Gemara says, now if you say correctly that avodim, that slaves are considered like movable objects, so then it makes sense to say why they are not included in the sale at the beginning of the Mishnah. Only if the person says kol masha besocha, that includes avodim, otherwise not. But if you're going to say that avodim are considered to be like land, so then why aren't the avodim included in the first part of the Mishnah as well, in the sale of the city? And so the Gemara says, 1 second, Vielamai, rather, what are you going to say? Kimetaltal adam, you're going to say that it's like movable objects. So my afilu, if it's like movable objects, but why do you have to say afilu? Even if there were animals, even if there were slaves, that's included. What's the even? You have to say alamayis lachlameim, or rather, what are you forced to say? Shani metaltal adenayid mi metaltal adelonayid. The Mishnah is making a distinction between movable objects that actually move on their own and movable objects that do not move on their own. Meaning, you might have, let's say, a utensil, a vessel. That's something that doesn't move on its own, but the Mishnah was saying even slaves which move on their own, they are also included. But once you're already saying there's a difference between things that move on their own and things that don't, so then afilu teima mekarka dami, then you can even say that avodim are considered to be like land, but shani mekarka denayid, but there's a difference between land that moves around on its own, mi mekarka delonayid, from land that does not move. The avodim are able to move, and that's why they're not included, even though maybe they are considered to be like land, but they're not included in the sale in that first part of the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Ravina Ravashi, Ravina said to Ravashi, Tashma, come in here, a proof from the Mishnah Meseches Peah we quoted earlier. Hakosev le'avdo kol nechasav yotza ben chorn. If a person writes over all of his property to his slave, that means that he's setting the slave free, the Eved goes free in that situation. But shayer karka kolshu, but let's say he leaves for himself even a little bit of land, so lo yotza ben chorn, so the Tanakam of the Mishnah says the Eved does not go free, because maybe the land that he's being shayer actually is referring to the Eved, because an Eved can be considered like karka. Rabbi Shimon says, Liolam hu ben chorn, he always goes free, at sheyomer, unless he says it in the following fashion. If he says, Kol nechasai nesunin, leploni avdi, if he says, all of my property is given to so-and-so my Eved, chutz me'echad me'ribo shabehen, except for 1/10,000th of them, so then already the 1/10,000th might refer to the Eved himself. In that case, the Eved won't go free, but otherwise, the Eved does go free. And on that Mishnah of Yamar Rav Dimi Bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Rav Dimi Bar Yosef said that Rabbi Lazar said, and this is the statement we quoted above at the top of the Yamud, Asu metaltal in shiur eitz eleven. Let's say the person, he left out not karka. It's not a case of shayar karka kolshu. Let's say he left out some kind of metaltalin, and the seller kept that for himself. That also is considered a shiur eitz eleven. That's also considered leaving a remnant in terms of the Eved, meaning the metaltalin also might refer to the Eved. V'lo asu metaltalin shiur eitz al ksuba, and that we quoted above. When it comes to leaving off by the ksuba, metaltalin is not considered something that is a shiur, because the ksuba is generally collected with land. It's generally collected from karka. And the Gemara continues, V'yomer le Rava le Rav Nachman, and Rava said to Rav Nachman, my time, what is the reason? Why is it that metaltalin is considered a shiur eitz al eved? Because av the metaltalahu, because a slave moves around. A slave is considered to be a movable object. U'metaltal le metaltala have a shiur, and therefore, if you have one movable object regarding another movable object, that's considered a shiur. U'ksubasisha mekarkohu, however, ksubasisha, that's considered land because it's collected from land. U'metaltala le mekarkohu lo have a shiur, and metaltalin, with regard relative to karka, relative to land, is not considered to be a shiur. And so we see from this discussion that an Eved is considered metaltalin, an Eved is considered a movable property, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Nun Amud Beis.